Can I take you back, some of you, to the 1990s, the early 1990s? You're in Eastern Europe, and Gorbachev has just been subject to a coup. Soviet army is just pulling back from Poland and Czechoslovakia, and this causes Poland to be really unhappy because they think that the Soviets are going to start rolling back into Poland. And Ted and I are on the Russian border because we're visiting Bialowieza for the very first time. And we didn't just go in, as the tourists do, to the single kilometre that you're allowed to do there on a cart. I'd arranged because I was on a Churchill Fellowship, I'd arranged to go in with Professor Okolov, who was the leading scientist of Bialowieza at the time. And we did the cycle route, the whole inner cycle route, all the way round inside. Obviously, Ted and I were blown away about that, but this was before I joined the Woodland Trust. I've always been had a long-term interest in conservation and wildlife, ever since I grew up on the edge of Chobham Common. So then after about 4 years, I joined the Woodland Trust, and I was really interested to understand how you manage woodlands, to manage them for biodiversity, as opposed to perhaps a forestry agenda, for example. In that meantime, Ted was at Windsor Great Park, and he was becoming very interested in these great old ancient trees. And because I knew Ted very well, I was getting involved in that. And when I joined the Woodland Trust, I was very interested to learn about what makes old-growth woodland, what is it, and what makes it tick. And then by sheer luck, Ted talks to everybody. He talked to a Dutchman, and within a few moments, it seemed, I had France's thesis in Dutch with an English abstract summary, and in one of the appendices, the lists of sites that he had visited as inspiration for his theory. And Ted and I were then away. We were going in every single one of the sites that he'd been to. But we went with our ancient tree heads on, and we have had equivalent of about half a century of looking at big old ancient trees. And what I want to concentrate on this afternoon is ancient maiden oak trees. I'm not talking about pollards, I'm talking about maiden trees, i.e. ones that have grown on their own all their long lives, not being cut as part of a commoning system or by a farming community or a local community. And my thesis is that by looking at these trees and by looking at each one that's alive today, it's a time machine. By looking at its form, we can go way back into the past and understand how those trees have grown all their long lives. And one of the keys to that are these huge, lower, open-grown limbs, which we know are hugely important for biodiversity. Or Keith is starting to emphasize that point, and we know that these are really important structures. Where do these ancient trees grow? Well, a significant number of them grow in our medieval landscapes, something that is largely unsung in the British landscape, but it's largely lost from other parts of Europe. And we have something which is hugely precious, and yet we're only just starting to understand this medieval landscape, which goes back to Anglo-Saxon times. Significant numbers of these open-grown ancient oaks are in places like Windsor Great Park and Forest, or perhaps places like Blenheim Palace or Cornbury Park. But if you delve a bit deeper, you find that they were carved out of the ancient Anglo-Saxon forest of Wychwood. So these are taking us way back in time, back to before England came into existence as a separate state. And my contention is that these, our wildest trees, which were largely unplanted, are a product of Franz Vera's theory of landscape origin. We know they've been grazed all their long lives, primarily for the deer, but also used by the king and commoners for grazing cattle and ponies and pigs and other livestock. In these environments, oak, which is a very light-demanding tree, can grow up from a sapling to full crown maturity and then grow downwards, as we colloquially put it, to become the little old squat, fat, hollow ancients that we see today. If they had been shaded, they wouldn't exist. And this is a key point about the comparison between Bialowieza forest and our medieval landscapes. Let's take a closer look at some of these maiden oaks. So here's one in Sherwood Forest, one of the perhaps most famous oak trees in the world. You can see it's not a pollard. Some have debated that, but it's quite clearly not a pollard. It is a maiden tree. This happens to be the largest in Sherwood Forest. It's 10 meters in girth. It's about 2 meters up to the first branch, which comes out horizontally. It produces a huge crown, 30 to 34 meters in diameter, all the way round as a giant circle. Let's take a look at another one. This happens to be one of my absolute all-time favorites. What an amazing 10-meter tree. But look at this these amazing limbs. My friend David is 6 foot. That's a 3-meter limb, a 3-meter girth limb out here, so far away from the trunk. And the branches for this tree go all the way out, and that's not even, well, it's only about 1 meter above the ground. And these have actually, under their own weight, are layering and are then taking off and growing on in the future. So these trees have grown out. Their crowns have been browsed, possibly up to a very low height, but then they produce these amazing crown spreads, 17 meters in radius or more. How many have we got of these trees in the UK? Well, Alios Farjon has done a big study, and his book has just been published, Ancient Oaks of England. He has found he particularly studied 9-meter girth oaks in England, and he's found that we have something in the region of 126. All during the time when his publication was going to press, I kept ringing him up and saying, Alios, we found another one. Alios, we found another one. They're coming in about one every 3 to 6 months on average, and we still don't think that we've got all of them recorded in the UK. So we have a very, very significant collection of them by comparison with the rest of Europe. Many of these are maidens. Alios thinks it's 42%. I actually believe that that proportion is higher, because once an ancient tree has become very hollow and it's lost most of its crown, it's quite difficult to tell whether it was actually a pollard or whether it was actually a maiden tree that has just lost its central trunk. So I think we would be looking at a higher proportion there. Not one of these has the form of the biggest oaks that are in Bialowieza. Poland does have its 9-meter girth oaks. Not one of them is in Bialowieza forest. All of those all of the ones in Europe that I've seen over 9 meters have the same form as the British are British oaks. But there are very few of them, and generally speaking, they've become very isolated. And we could go into that, but I probably won't have time to. So how old are these trees? Well, and I'm looking at 9-meter oaks. John White was the first to really start looking at this. He followed in the footsteps of the great Alan Mitchell, and he came up with a model. It's not a direct estimate. You have to feed in different environmental conditions, but it's related to girth. And John then did a very detailed study at Windsor, and he was indicating to Ted that 9-meter oaks at Windsor would be something in the region of 850 years old. And then we have work done at Lullingston Park on dendrochronology, and here Andy Moyer looked at 9-meter oak, this tree particularly, 9 meters, and he came up with 850 years old. But we have 126 trees which are 9 meters or more. And of course, in the UK, they go up to 14.3 meters with ones that are alive. And in the past, they've gone up to 14.7. I think the largest in Europe by girth at the moment is the one in Sweden, the Kvilleken, which is something in the region of 10 meters 7. Although that is measured, generally speaking, at 1.3 meters. And that could be slightly affected by the way it's measured. So we could be talking about 10 meters that we've just been looking at, the major oak, something in this region, 11 meters going up to 1,000 years, back to the time of William the Conqueror, which takes me on to these medieval forests, a favorite of William the Conqueror. But before I do that, we're going to look at a Bialowieza oak, which has a girth of 6.2 meters, and they say that that's about 600 years old. So it's within the realms of the figures that Andy Moore came up with. And the largest in Bialowieza is about 7.25, and it's around about 650. Did I read that correctly? 650 years old, something of that sort. So just have that in your mind as you're thinking about it. What we've been hearing about this morning is how shade kills oaks. And here is evidence. This poor old beautiful oak was planted up by dense competition, a plantation around it. It's subsequently been haloed, which is marvelous, but the damage has been done to this tree. Look at those dead limbs. And this worries us in the world of ancient trees because those are the lifeblood of the tree as it starts to grow downwards. And having shaded it out and damaged that part of the tree, we don't know how significant that damage is to this tree's long life. And this one, by its girth, one would be expecting to live a very long time indeed. As I've been saying, these in the open are extremely valuable for biodiversity, but that is very badly affected by being shaded out. So we know then that these oaks this oak, you can look at it again, and we know that that tree has been grown in the open all its life. If it had been shaded out latterly, I think you would have seen evidence of those big limbs still on the trunk of the tree, which is an important point when we start to look at the Bialowieza oaks. Now, if we look at a map that Della Hook has given me and is in her book on Anglo-Saxon woodland and trees, these hatched areas, which you can see, now today contain some of the best concentrations of ancient oaks that we have, not just in the UK, but in the whole of Europe, and Alios has confirmed that by his work. Sherwood Forest here, Windsor Great Park here, New Forest, Epping Forest here, all sorts of places. These are, and you also have Wychwood Forest here, Wychwood, I don't know how to pronounce the Anglo-Saxon. But of course, we know that those forests with a capital F were not for the trees. They were for the deer. The protected plants were the holly and the ivy, because that was important winter food for the deer, and also the oaks, because they produced massive acorns, not just for the pigs, but to fatten up the deer to take them through the long winter, because deer were an incredibly important high-status creature for the medieval kings. And it was when William conquered England, he said, "These are now mine," and he took the very best for himself. And many of these are in public ownership still today through William's work in 1,000 years ago in 1066. And we know a lot about these woods, although we haven't really investigated them as significantly as we could, through his other fantastic piece of work that he did, which was to send out his surveyors and produce the Doomsday Book. What we have, though, is, thanks to the work of two Oxford dons, Jack Langton and Graham Jones, we have some old definitions of forest. Wild, uncultivated tracts of ground with wood, wild woody grounds, wild beasts, wild fowls, in the safe protection of the king for his pleasure. And we know that Needham Forest, which is up in this area, might be that one, was actually one of the last places in England to be civilized in the medieval period. It had the lowest population, and people then started to move into that landscape. These were truly, truly wild. But what's so interesting to me is that these places have huge resonance today. The names are on the maps. People live in Selwood, Selwudo. They live in a landscape that's got the name that's associated with it. They have huge resonance with our population because of the history of our landscape and our knowledge about William the Conqueror, etc., etc. So from a resonance in terms of understanding and communication, they're important, but they're also incredibly important for their biodiversity value. But the other thing is, of course, deer have been really important in the making of these landscapes. They were very, very high status. Presence of deer, either alive or dead, were more important than gold and precious jewels at the time. So they have been amazingly important, but that isn't a recent phenomenon. We only have to go to the cave paintings of southern Europe, or even into the caves of Nottingham at Cresswell Crags, and you will find the carvings of deer in those cave landscapes. They weren't doing it as a preamble to hunting them. They valued these creatures, like the deer, for their characteristics and their spiritual qualities. And the deer are the only ones of those animals, those large herbivores, on the caves that have actually survived in the wild. And we have them in very significant numbers in Britain, and we should feel very blessed as we perhaps move into a greater understanding of wild landscapes and the part that large herbivores have to play, that we already have wild deer so prominent in the countryside and so important. Where else in Europe can you go and see red deer in the numbers that we have them here? And deer more or less on every walk that you do in the countryside. We are extremely lucky. We can't bring back the auroch. Of course we can't, it went extinct. And the last wild bison was killed in the wild in 1920s. We have a hope with the bison, and thanks to the Dutch, they are putting bison back into the landscape and also in other parts of Europe. And perhaps we could be a little bit more adventurous in the landscape. I mean, after all, these are herbivores. They're not like carnivores that are chasing us to eat us. These are herbivores that actually want to eat green stuff, and it just so happens that we might get in the way and be harmed by them. Surely there's a great difference here. Anyway, I digress. I'm going off on one. Let's get back to trees. And here we are in Bialowieza. This is one of the largest trees. Immediately, an incredibly different form. no lower branching on this huge straight stem reaching up to the sky, tiny little crown on the top. So we have a very different structure here, and this is typical of the oaks that we see in Bialowieza. As I said earlier, not one of our 9-meter oak girths that's a maiden has anything like this structure at all, and this one can't grow downwards. In fact, this is what happens to them. When they get to a certain age, they fall over and collapse to the valley floor because they have a small crown. That very tiny glade is very shady, very rapidly gets filled up by shade-tolerant trees, which are very often of a very short duration in their lives, and often, as in the case that Neil's been talking about, species which actually aren't anything like as rich for biodiversity as the oaks are. So, what about this shade tolerance and light-demanding value of trees? Well, Scots pine is very low tolerance to shade. Oaks are low, hornbeam very, very high. I think you can see how foresters manipulate this in growing their forest trees. All over Central Europe, starts with a plantation of Scots pine. They thin that, in comes the oak. That grows up, and after that comes in the shade-tolerant trees like hornbeam, chase those trees right to the sky to produce great long tall stems which are clean bold. And here is a typical view of Bialowieza. There is your remnant Scots pine. Here are your straight bold oak trees, and here is your regeneration of hornbeam understory. So we could explain this landscape at Bialowieza by a forestry plantation if we so wanted to. Now, Bialowieza is an old hunting forest for the kings of Lithuania and Poland and then the Tsar. And there are one or two trees which are outside the strict reserve, which are actually not really properly understood or valued, and I think is probably a pollard anyway, so wouldn't fit my story. But old paintings from 1861, here's the lower limb like this here, where he was jumping out of the way of the bison that they were hunting. So there were trees in the forest there, but they have subsequently all gone. Digress very briefly into Scots pine. Worries me in Scotland because our fattest Scots pine in Scotland is this one. Look how open grown it is, all its long life. We had a branch off here, down here, that one of us counted, and it was 600 years old on the branch alone, 600 rings on the branch alone. That tree has grown in the open all its long life. And I suppose that's a key point. We should be looking at our ancient trees. Every single species of ancient tree tells us a different story about the history of our treed landscape in the past. So that brings me on to, well, how do you generate the wildest trees in Britain? Learning from our old oaks. Then again, we come back to these old sayings, which were old sayings in the Tudor times, Elizabethan times. The thorn is the mother of the oak, and the French have a similar one. The bramble is the mother of the oak. This is an incredible way in which we can actually generate these trees to become open-grown ones of the future in a grazed landscape and carry on to be the 1,000-year-old oaks of whoever is, if there is any monarchy, in the year 3000. This happens to be Borkna Paradis, but this could be Knepp Estate. So my final words are, we can learn from the fantastic historic landscapes of England and start thinking about how important they are and how they fit with Franz's theory. My only worry about these landscapes is that they have just deer in them or have had very few browsers. And we know that if you only have one or two grazing animals, they will drive the system in one particular way, and we need a multitude of grazing animals of different types in those landscapes to actually really drive the kaleidoscope properly. Thanks very much.